This is episode 28 of the Hybrid Coaching Podcast. In this episode, JK and I discuss, are we stronger when a member of the opposite sex is watching you lift or run? Do you exert more? And we have some data and science to back it up. Additionally, we go into threshold, what it's about, and everything you might need to know definition-wise about threshold for hybrid fitness racing. And it sounds like Lily wants to say something. Let's make hybrid fitness work for you. How you doing today, JK?
I am very well, thank you. Anthony, how are you?
Good. We got 2 weeks. 2 weeks to Hong Kong.
Man. It's actually 2 weeks. Yes, it's exactly 2 weeks for me.
And you're 2 hours behind them, right? So, or 2 hours ahead of them. So you your time zone's right. It's like 2 weeks and what, half a day?
Yeah. So have you done your
Fortnight.
due diligence and understood the timing?
The timing for
Yeah, like what time are we going to be racing when you're watching it at home?
Oh yeah. So I think they said you got the women, I think, start at 6 and you guys are at 7.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe like 6 and 7:30. They might move it back to 5:30. Anyway, yes, I've done my due diligence. I have a very, very early morning or late night, depends how it looks at it. Hopefully, I have an early morning. I would rather wake up having already slept than rather than not, So
I'm gonna put money on that you're going to just be up all night.
so right now that timing is 3 a.m. for me.
Wow.
So it's 3 a.m. is when the women's race starts, and then the men's race will be like 4:30 in the morning. So I am hoping, against hope, that like maybe, just maybe, I can get to bed at like 10 the night before and wake up at like 2:30, watch both races, be completely jacked up, not be able to go back to sleep, but still try to go back to sleep.
Yeah. And then after my race, go out with Lily and get
Oh, she
15
won't
miles
be
under your belt.
she won't be up. So
No, it's exciting, mate, because it's come around quickly now, which is great. So I've got another 1 week or just shy of 1 week of pretty, grueling training until Maple Week. So
yeah, so you
exciting.
specifically, if you want to go into that, yeah, you're approaching the end. You take your rest day on a Sunday. Well, rest day. You take your active recovery day on a Sunday. I say rest day, but rest day just means that you don't have any intensity and you're not going for however many hours you go for. You only go for an hour. So,
Yeah.
your active recovery day is a Sunday. You're going hard. You got 2 days left of that. And then you'll have your active recovery day. You'll have another 2 days before you really begin deload into taper. So
Yeah,
deload.
sorry, that's right. A 10-day specific taper. It's funny because I still think half my taper is still somewhat strenuous, right? But it's just making sure that we're giving the right stimulus to my body than too much, right?
Exactly. Given the right stimulus, and also like we're not suddenly ending, we taper, it's not sudden. It's not like you're going from this big full volume into nothing. You're still getting small adaptations, small things, mental adjustments too. But really, it's like the start of the taper, the first day of the taper is like you're still doing 90%, 95% of the day before. It's not going to
Yeah,
feel like a
yeah,
lot.
exactly.
It's just slightly reduced, and then we slightly reduce again. And that's why, like we talked about it, it's you go up, up, up. We've been building, and then you're going to deload. So like you're just going to like let your body rebound a little bit, and then you keep going just like you're training, except for the volume starts to get cut, the time and intensity, all that like modulates down. And then we try to get you on a good biorhythm to rebound so you're at your peak when it comes time to perform.
Yep.
And
Yep.
each one of those steps, like if you were to look at it day to day, yeah, the first day of your taper, the official first day of your taper, people would look at it and be like, that's a full day of training. And it's like, well, yeah, it's 95%. And then the second day, it's like, okay, I could see a little bit less than a normal day. Okay, a little bit less. And it just gradually comes down. And then you have your like active recovery day again. And then after that, it's like, okay, now we really want that recovery to rebound you. So we go after that active recovery into the rest of your taper.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
The goal is get your
Um,
body, get your mind, everything to feel as good as possible on the day you need to perform.
yeah, correct. Yep. Exciting stuff, mate. I'm excited.
Very exciting. So this week I actually prepared, um, like we do, I got ready. I made a PowerPoint for this episode. Uh,
Great.
if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or the other places we have it, you don't have to watch the video. I'll be able to describe everything. A lot of it is just like PowerPoint with words. I don't even know if I'll bring it up during that point. There is only one part where I'm going to show a chart, but we want to talk about threshold. The last couple weeks, actually, through the programming and coaching, and I'm sure JK, you get these questions all the time, but I got multiple questions that I was just kind of like, I answered them to the people, and at the same time, I was like, you know what, maybe that's a topic people would want to hear to talk about. And it had to deal with threshold, and I was like, you know what, we haven't done a threshold episode in a couple months now. Let's put out another threshold episode. And a lot of it has to do with terminology and the lexicon of threshold, because you hear threshold and people are like, all right, that's that I'm gonna go hard, right? And it's I'm gonna maximize, I'm gonna reach my threshold limit mentally or physically. And it's like, that's not really what it is. It's an internal body system threshold that you're reaching. Um, what we're gonna do with that is we kind of want to name and go over the verbiage used with threshold. And if you're a sports scientist, I might have some outdated information, but I've just been combing through a lot of the science journals and everything, trying to make sure that the way that I understand it is correct projecting forward. And I also want to get into like why we use threshold, why, at least on the hybrid engine program, why we believe the threshold method is the best way for training in hybrid fitness. And now I say the best way, but it's the best way for the way we do it. There are a lot of different ways to do it, and you need to find a way that works for you to really be successful. But the way
Yeah,
that I program and move and the volume we go into, I believe it works very well for what we're trying to accomplish.
definitely.
Sustained
And
health and growth.
I can, well, yeah. And I'm like, I'll be honest, I'm a prime example of this, Anthony, because for working with you, I wasn't doing a lot of threshold training at all, but for my Hawks races. And then since we've been working together, we've been doing a lot of it, and my performance can show. So I'm excited to dive deeper here as well.
Yeah. And I'm really hoping
It's such a
actually,
buzzword now as well, isn't it?
yeah, it really is. And I'm really hoping actually that as I go through this, you being a coach and understanding, as well as any questions you might have, that you just fire them off so you can act as not only the audience asking questions for them, but also assisting me in uh,
Yeah,
getting
perfect.
the information out. Additionally, I wanted to say, like, I was going through all these journal articles, and I found a great one that I just want to read first. And this is really interesting to me. The presence of observers and one repetition maximums. So did you know this is great information? You better get Georgie ready for this, JK. All right.
There you go, Georgie.
Uh, they did a study, 25 men, 24 men, 25 women, and they did counterbalance trials, and they had them all these athletes test their bench press and their leg press. All right, so two different exercises.
Yep.
Um, During one trial, two members of the opposite gender observe the 1 rep max test. So they were basically, you had two people watching you do your 1 rep max. During the other trial, there were no observers except for the person testing. All right. So and I'm just going to ask you ahead of time, do you think when people, and I'm not just people, but for men, when women are watching them work out, do they lift more weight? And for women, do they lift more weight when men are watching them work out?
Definitely. 100%. And the
So,
reason why I'm just so like one-sided definitely is because Georgie and I don't train at the same gym at the moment. She randomly had to come in the other day to do a session at my gym because of time purposes. But if I'm really being honest with you, with myself right now, Anthony, I pushed harder because she was there, or like I was training harder, or I was like subconsciously, I don't know. If I think about it, I'm like, yeah, like because she was there, I had to prove to myself or prove to
yeah.
her, or I don't know.
So
But it's so true.
I'm just going to cut down to the results of this study. Others, I found more studies like this because I went down a rabbit hole. Once I found this one, I started looking at others. Um, but for this one, the 1 rep maxes for the men increased by 4.2 pounds, 2 kilos on the bench press when women were watching them bench press. They
Wow.
also increased 18.8 pounds with a delta of 5.2 plus or minus on the leg press. So you're looking at 9 kilos on the leg press. They got more when women were watching these men work out. And
That's massive.
other studies I
Oh,
found, other studies I found showed that when women watch men or are present when men are working out, the men exert higher energy or they will exert. So they'll try to run faster, they'll try to lift more weights and everything. So if you have a motivation problem, get your significant other or go to a place where there's somebody of the opposite gender watching you, do this. And going the other way, this one study that I'm referencing right now, the women did have slight increases as well, 1 to 1.5 kilos on the bench press and almost 5 kilos on the leg press when men were present. Other studies found that women don't actually get as much elevated exertion levels when men are present. So the women out there, you don't get as much from it if guys are watching you. But guys out there, if you get a woman to watch you, you exert more in your workouts and
that's
efforts.
interesting. That's actually such an interesting study, isn't it? I hands down agree with it. Totally agree with it when I think about it.
Yeah, I mean,
Do
I
you?
when
Do you
Lauren
think you?
comes in and
Yeah,
watches me work out, I definitely go harder. I'm like, I gotta get it.
you gotta. Yeah, subconsciously, you gotta impress, mate.
Well,
You always
mostly
gotta.
too, if like, because she's told me before too that she's not gonna spot my bench press because it's too heavy, and so I have to be able to get it. So if she's there and I'm like struggling, I don't want to like dump the weight with her there. So I definitely push it harder when she's there.
Yeah,
Versus like if I was alone and I like struggled, I might be like, nobody's around. I'll just dump the weights and get up.
yeah.
So higher level
Listeners, if you're
exertion.
listening to this, please, we would love your opinion or we'd love your comments on this topic.
Yeah. Do you have a significant other that watches you work out and does it make you go harder?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I just wanted to go over that one before we started. So, what brought up this topic is I actually got several questions, like I said, through our training program the last few weeks of, what is my threshold? Well, what is this? I've been told my threshold before is this, and you're saying it's this, or I've been told it's this, and you're saying it's way slower. Why am I running it at this pace? Why am I running it at that pace? And also, people who have asked me like, you told me my threshold was this, but I didn't feel like I was working hard enough. So I sprinted and ran really hard and like I got more out of it. I got that feeling of accomplishment after because I was just dead after my threshold runs and I liked that. And it's like, okay, well, that's not the intent of it. Uh,
Yep.
and I just want to explain it a little. So we're going to go over that today.
I think just quickly, Anthony, threshold, the word. doesn't mean all out, correct? Doesn't mean you should be feeling um absolutely gasping for air and gassed afterwards.
No, it does not mean that you should be gasping for air and completely out of it after. I'm having trouble here. Hang on a second. Trying to display slideshow. Okay. Just so that I had notes, I was going to do this in a way that I am going to be reading a little bit today, just so everyone knows. If you like are watching or something, you should be able to see me still. Should be able to be talking, but I'll definitely just still be going over um, what JK and I are talking about so that anybody not on video is able to still follow along. It's more about the information, not necessarily about what's on the screen. All right,
Perfect.
can you see it?
Yep.
All right, JK, do you have anything before we get started? I kind of just made this little slideshow. Threshold is everything, and it's about our 28th episode here.
All right, let's get into it, mate. I'm excited.
All right, let's go right on the threshold. So, what are the tests? So, basically, what we're going to go over, there's multiple field tests you can do where like you estimate your threshold based off of like a performance or something. But in terms of like scientific testing, the two main tests are going to be a blood lactate test and a respiratory exchange ratio test. Rate, right? The one that I like to do, the one that I've found most helpful is definitely the blood lactate test. That's the one that I've advised you to do, JK. That's the one that I've advised multiple people to do, just because I feel it's very accurate and helpful,
Yep.
and really target and get it in there. I'm starting with the test, but we're going to jump back and forth, and um, we'll talk about some definitions and everything in this as well, right? Uh, you have anything on the blood lactate test? Have you ever done a respiratory exchange ratio rate?
I haven't yet, mate. I'm intrigued to learn a little bit more about this one.
Yeah, so that's the one where they put the big mask on you and they have
Yeah.
you like run with it on there. Um, so yeah, we got both. Blood lactate test. So you do the test in a lab, right? Or in our situation, as clean as possible in the dirty gym. We try to make it as scientific as possible and replicate it as simply as possible. But basically, you do the test in the lab, and you prick either your finger or your ear. We've talked about this one before, and you determine the lactate concentration. So I'm not going to go over it too much because there's a past episode if you're wondering about the actual how to do it. And I will talk about how we do it as well, but uh, this is just how it's taken, right? And I promise people, I've been asked this question. I will make a video on how to do lactate testing with your lactate meter and how I like to measure it.
Yeah.
You'll be running or you'll be cycling because you can do it on a bike as well. Usually, you'll have it on a treadmill, trainer, ergometer. You can do it on a lot of things though. Like I've said before, you can actually do it on a rower, a ski erg, a bike. You can do it a ton of different ways, but it's got to be something constant where it's repetitive motion. That's really
Yeah.
key, is you really want that repetitive motion. And then you take lactate levels through the blood test at constant intervals with as a ramp test. So you each interval you ramp up speed or intensity somehow, right? In this type, I prefer, and this is what I prescribe usually, is a 5-minute step test with 60 seconds in between where you just go get your blood drawn. And that blood draw is a full rest. So 5 minutes on, 1 minute off. During that minute, you need to get your blood taken. And if you're doing it yourself, that's a really fast minute. It goes by quick.
It is. Yeah.
If
Yep.
you're doing it with a partner, usually it's a little bit more helpful, especially because you're trying to make sure you're clean. So you're wiping your hands off, pricking everything. Usually we aim for 5 to 8 intervals of this test and try to target our LT2 level, which we'll get into what LT2 is. That's something I want to define as the fourth interval of the test. Yep. Or we split it over two intervals, but yeah, the fourth one. Yeah. Any
Yep.
questions there?
No.
All right. Measuring the respiratory rate. So if you were to do a respiratory exchange rate ratio, uh, on this one, and just be honest, I'm copying this out of something else that said it because I've never done an RER. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide produced in the body compared to the rate of oxygen inhaled. It's called the respiratory exchange ratio. You use a ergometry system to do this. You'll be running or cycling in the lab just as the same as the blood lactates, but you'll be breathing through a valve so that your rate of CO2 production and oxygen inhalation can be measured. So you can get like, oh, they're producing this much CO2 when they breathe out. They're bringing in this much oxygen when they breathe in. That gets really important later on, though, and I'll get to
Okay.
that. Um,
Just quickly, can this RER uh give you an LT1 and an LT2
Yep.
pace?
So it'll give you both as long as you're over the span of the distances and intensities that you need. Like I said, I don't have experience with this one as I do with the blood lactate testing. But if you find an experienced professional, usually people who do VO2 max testing and other things, they should be able to help you out with this one. So if that's what you're looking for. Here we go. Definitions and naming conventions. So I like this one a lot. We're just going to get into what each thing is, and then the next slide is going to have the graph. And I use my own lactate threshold chart to demonstrate where things are on the graph so that they can be seen pretty easily. So the aerobic threshold. So people talk about, oh, what's your threshold? What do you run your threshold at? Where's you want to be at your threshold? Well, threshold, that word is actually used in so many different ways. There's aerobic threshold, anaerobic threshold, ventilatory threshold 1, ventilatory threshold 2, lactate threshold 2, functional threshold power, like onset of lactate blood accumulation. Like we will get into what each one of those things are because you want to kind of know what you're talking about. And so the
Yep.
aerobic threshold measured in a blood lactate test, uh, we're going to say is the exact same as the ventilatory threshold one. Now, these could be off just a little bit, but the slightness that they're off is nothing compared to like the measurement of the entire graph. So aerobic threshold is also your VT1, ventilatory threshold 1, and you get your ventilatory threshold as it was measured in a respiratory exchange ratio test, right? So I would measure my aerobic threshold during the blood lactate test and the respiratory exchange ratio test. They would measure the ventilatory threshold 1. Ideally, they should be lined up or very, very close to each other.
Yep.
Uh, the lactate threshold, when people talk about their lactate threshold, they're usually talking about LT2. Okay. Aerobic threshold would be LT1. Lactate threshold or the anaerobic threshold is LT2. It would be the same as the ventilatory threshold 2. It's also roughly the same as if you're a biker, your functional threshold. So that'd be if you hear people talk about their FTP in cycling, right? Functional threshold power. Uh, that would be the same as their LT2. You measure the lactate threshold, the anaerobic threshold. Those are measured in the blood test. The ventilatory threshold 2 is measured in the RER. Okay.
Yeah,
Do you have
cool.
anything questions about that? Pretty simple, straightforward, right? Uh,
Pretty simple, straightforward. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and there's these other terms, like the onset of blood lactate accumulation, OBLA, and the maximum lactate steady state, MLSS. They're basically, for now, sports scientists out there are gonna say, no, they're not. Well, they're close enough for our approximation here. They're essentially the same as the anaerobic threshold. So that would be
Okay.
LT2. One
Yep.
thing to keep in mind, you'll see a lot of confusion about an incorrect usage of these terms all over the internet, especially like people just writing articles about them or saying other just random things about it on forums and blogs and stuff. They'll be referencing one and meaning the other, or meaning one and referencing a different one, right? So there's LT1 and LT2, and that's what we're just going to base it off of. Um, some people will talk about the threshold or call it the aerobic threshold or the lactate threshold. Um, but that's not necessarily correct if you're talking about the threshold or the aerobic threshold or the lactate threshold, because most of the time the lactate threshold is typically defined as the anaerobic threshold. So that's why I said there's two pieces to this. and we're just trying to get terminology correct on each one. So let's make sure you understand the two types of threshold so that you can, when people talk about it, you will have an understanding from the context of which threshold they're talking about, aerobic
Yeah, which
or
is
anaerobic.
which is really important because like my athletes always not always, but I get questions like confusion of LT1 versus LT2 and which one's anaerobic, which one's aerobic. So
Yeah. And we'll get into it too, because even in a high rocks, there's a difference on what you want to be training and who should be training for what. And that's towards the end of the
yeah,
slideshow. I'll show you. And what are the points of it are at the end of this, I want to show you, well, once we get our LT1 and LT2, how do we use it for training and how do we use it for racing? And that'll depend on the person. That gets towards the end of this. But and I'm also wanting to find the term fat max, right? So the fat max is it's the range of exercise intensity where your fat oxidation is at its highest. It's not super low intensity, but it's not a very high intensity either. And as a matter of fact, it corresponds super well with your aerobic threshold, right?
yep,
So we'll get into that. All right, so this is my lactate chart, right? And if I look at it here, if I had like kept going earlier in the warm up and been taking more measurements, I should have put them on here, but I didn't put them on the graph. Right here, it'd be pretty level, and then all of a sudden you see this first little bump at like 8.3 miles per hour, right?
yep,
8.4 miles per hour. I get a little bump in my lactate. My lactate goes literally from 1 to 2.1. Uh,
mm,
this value right here, where this first bump is, that is my aerobic threshold. It's also my fat max. See this point right here, and then the other inflection point where it starts to turn up again. So you see we got the first curve, and then we get the second curve where it starts to go basically just almost parabolic.
yep.
Over here, so from here to here, you see it's a straight line basically. And then all of a sudden it deviates really hard. This is the point of steepest slope deviation right there. That is my inflection point. That would be my LT2. So I got my LT1, my LT2. This one, aerobic threshold, ventilatory threshold 1, LT1, all of them point to right here. Anaerobic threshold, lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold 2, functional threshold, and LT2 are all over here at the second inflection point where it starts to go upward. All right. So you see the 2 points of the graph, you can almost make it like straight level. Okay, it goes up. We got a continuous up, and then it breaks from that up and it goes really steep. And so for me, it's looking at about 8.6 to 9.3.
Yeah.
0.2, right? So this would be my thresholds. And also OBLA and MLSS, maximum lactate steady state, they're defined as over here. So this is just a visual of what we just talked about in terms of which point is which, because you have all these talking points that people talk about, and you want to know which one's which. Any questions on that?
No, just quit. Sorry, yes. Fat max. Are you pretty much saying, sorry, just explain fat max and the actual description of that?
So you have a certain level of fat oxidation that you're able to get to, right? And so the fat max is where you are utilizing, I think this is right. It's where you're utilizing all of the um, fat availability that your body can use at once.
Yes.
So your ability to process that fat is being used right there. So it's at its highest point. It's full.
So, and a little bit off topic, but correct me if I'm wrong. After that point, that's why carbohydrates are so important.
Yeah, because after that point you're burning glucose, you're burning carbs. Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. Cool.
You are two there, but that's where you can optimally burn fat.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Fat for fuel.
Fat for fuel. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So just some key takeaways that I have here. Aerobic threshold is your ventilatory threshold 1. Threshold is roughly your 3-hour race intensity, or if it's in a single modality, right? So like a marathon or a road cycling race. So single modality. 3-hour pace. Multiple modality, this can be taken down or even extended depending on what the modalities are. But for something like a Hyrox or a DecaFit, where we're switching in and out of anaerobic, because whenever you use higher levels of strength or you're doing something with strength, it definitely is going to increase the amount of glycogen you're using. So your glucose stores go down. But your it can be your 3-hour race intensity or even really anything over what we're going to talk about the anaerobic threshold being. So your anaerobic threshold is your ventilatory threshold 2, your lactate threshold, your OBLA, your maximum lactate steady state, your functional threshold. It's roughly your 1-hour race intensity. You know what's nice about that? What is the time domain of a Hyrox? JK, 50
50,
minutes?
52 minutes.
There you go. Uh, so you can go a little bit above your anaerobic threshold to be achieving 1-hour race intensity or 52-minute intensity, right? So that's why this is super important for us. If you're doing a
Yeah.
DecaFit, obviously you want to get to that steady state zone, but you can pop in and out of it more regularly in a DecaFit. Energy systems. We're just going to talk quickly about these energy systems because I don't want to get too scientific on them. I'm going to use words like pyruvate and ATP and other things that aren't necessarily needed to absolutely know, but they do help to understand. So these systems produce energy. So we have 3 different energy systems and mostly primary group energy systems. This is what moves us forward when we're swimming, biking, running, whatever it is, or moving the sled or moving the rower or moving the skier. This is what energy is what makes our muscles contract. Everything is a contraction, everything is a push, nothing is a pull. Well, everything is a pull, nothing's a push. Uh, the muscle cells use ATP for fuel. So ATP is super important. Adenosine triphosphate is super important because that's what your cells, your mitochondria, are using as fuel to make your muscles contract. So it's absolutely needed. The amount of ATP that they can store, though, is very, very small. So, it's only enough for a few seconds, maybe 10 seconds worth of actual movement. Okay. So that's that first initial boost. For anything longer than a few seconds, we need to use one of the 3 main energy systems. Okay. Do you have questions there?
No, but oh, sorry, yeah, like I get this question a lot. Like it's a rough the ATP system is there's no clear like it could be for me it could be 5 seconds worth of work. For you, it could be 10 seconds, right?
Yeah.
Is it individual? That's what I'm
Yes.
saying.
Yes. It's
Yeah,
not a set number. Like, for example, just this week I did a 25 calorie sprint on the Assault air bike.
that's right.
I guarantee
Yep.
almost all of that was just stored ATP, my ATP to PC system. Just immediate it took 13 seconds to do. And when I was done, I was breathing heavy, I was tired, and I was out, right? So, but it was enough stored fuel for me to just really crank it.
Yep. For
Um,
sure.
any longer than that, though, and I would have had to switch to a different energy system, and I would have been already depleted because I exerted so much at the beginning one.
Yep.
So that's the first system. This system uses creatine phosphate to produce extra ATP. Uh, this is anaerobic. Anaerobic just means without oxygen, right? So in order to turn creatine phosphate into ATP, you don't need oxygen. It's the dominant energy system. So there's actually some level of contribution from everything in every duration, but in for systems that are like 10 seconds for like the 100-meter dash, or some people, it could contribute lasting all the way up to 45 seconds. Somebody can't go solely on it for 45 seconds, but it could contribute for that long, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's the first one. Then you got glycosis. So glycosis breaks down glucose into ATP, and it does it through an intermediate product. It's called pyruvate. Pyruvate can be used to generate energy anaerobically, or it can be used by the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. it can be used by the mitochondria to create energy aerobically. And like I said, anaerobic is without oxygen, aerobic is with oxygen. Okay. So
Yeah.
glucose can be broken down with pyruvate into ATP with oxygen or without. In glycosis, pyruvate is used anaerobically to create energy. Lactate and hydrogen ions, also called lactic acid, that's what together they are, right, is produced. And just as a note, when we measure blood lactate, lactate is not the cause of fatigue. It's an indicator of fatigue. So it's like if you cleared all the lactate out, you'd still be fatigued because of all the hydrogen ions. You'd still be reaching acidosis, which causes fatigue, right? So the hydrogen ions are byproducts that will lower your blood pH if they're not cleared out. It's called acidosis, and it's the reason you start to feel the burn, right? When you accumulate all this hydrogen. So it's also where you start to decline in performance. Uh, the glucose energy system, it's responsible and dominant. So if you have the three energy systems and you're seeing which ones contribute, if it's 10 seconds, the first one, that ATP one, is very, very high. The creatine phosphate is the one that's contributing the most, and the other two are low. And then as you reach like longer durations, all of a sudden 30 seconds to 2 minutes, your glycosis would be the highest one, whereas like the creatine phosphate would be down and the aerobic oxidation would still be down as well. It contributes significantly all the way up to events in 10 minutes. However, the way that we run, if we run smartly in a Hyrox, there would be contributions from glycosis at intermediate points, especially when you hit those stations or when you need to call on it, right? So you can modulate it, like how much of that system you're using by adjusting your effort levels. Almost. You can't control this, but you can practice it. Do you have anything you want to add
Yep.
there, JK?
I'm good, man.
All right.
Yeah, no, I'm taking it all in myself. Hmm.
And so this one is the aerobic oxidation. So this is the one that matters so much. But you have to get through the others to get there. So in this system, oxygen is converted, or oxygen is used to convert pyruvate that we talked about previously to ATP aerobically. So now you're using the oxygen you breathed in. You're using it to convert the pyruvate we talked about previously into ATP in the mitochondria, rather than the pyruvate being converted to lactate, right? So pyruvate can become lactate, or it can be used with oxygen to become ATP. Comparing the energy systems, right, between glycosis and aerobic oxidation. If you use one glucose molecule in glycosis anaerobically, that means there's no oxygen. One glucose molecule with the pyruvate, no oxygen, can become two ATP molecules. So you get benefit of two, right? But in aerobic oxidation, if you're using that oxygen, one glucose molecule can become 32 ATP. So if you have effective breathing and you're taking in correct amount of oxygen to assist this system, you get 16 times the amount of energy um, output that you would if you were anaerobically. Does that make
Is
sense?
that for everyone, or is it individual
I
still?
think I think it'll be close, but that's how it breaks down.
Close,
So
right?
one glucose
Wow.
molecule, right? Chemistry. One glucose molecule can become 32 ATP with oxygen. One glucose molecule without oxygen and pyruvate can become 2 ATP.
Gotcha.
So it requires sufficient amount of oxygen. So this is why breathing and proper breathing control is very important. Um, Otherwise, pyruvate goes into the anaerobic energy system. So if you don't use it with oxygen, glucose contributes. So it uses up, your body uses all the glucose with oxygen to become 32 ATP. And when you're out of oxygen, your glucose still contributes to your energy system, but instead of breaking it down into instead of breaking down to 32, it only breaks down into two extra energies until you get more
Yeah.
oxygen there. The aerobic oxidation is slower than glycolysis, but it's dominant for anything lasting longer than 5 minutes, like Hyrox. Unless you're just absolutely amazing and do a Hyrox in 5 minutes, uh, you're going to be using your aerobic oxidation. Um, However, there's always more than one energy system that's being used at the same time. Like I talked about, there's three that we're talking about, and they're all used at varying levels. It's just which one is dominant at that time. The proportion of the contribution of different energy systems will vary based on the relative exercise intensity and duration. Right? For example, if you're in control of your pace on your run, you're just moving along. Okay. We're not going to get into what pace you're moving at, but your aerobic system is doing the majority of the work, although there's a small contribution from the anaerobic energy system. Now, then let's say you get to the sleds. You've been moving along, and now you get to the sleds, and somebody decide, or another way, somebody decides to make an attack on you on the run, and you try to go with them instead of just staying at the pace you're at, right? Suddenly, you're running at a harder intensity. Now, your anaerobic energy system or glucosis becomes a larger contributor of the energy. So now, instead of being patient with it and using all your oxygen, now you up the intensity, all your oxygen's used up, and your glucose, instead of converting to 32 ATP, your glycosis has to contribute because you need more ATP, but you don't have the oxygen to supply it. So instead of breaking it down to 32, it's breaking it down into 2, and glucosis becomes a larger contributor. Uh, so for a while, you're producing peak powers transitioning into the attack. You may have a larger contribution of the ATP PC system or glycosis. Makes sense? PC is
Makes
phosphocreatine,
sense. Yeah,
by the way.
yeah.
All right. What are the aerobic and the anaerobic thresholds from a lactate test? All right. So now we're going to get into it. If you measure your threshold using blood lactate samples, you'll get a chart like we showed that plots your blood lactate concentration against the intensity of power or speed. I like to do it against speed because it's we like to use just what is your pace at lactate threshold and which one, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you're running on the treadmill. You'll start at a very low intensity and maybe you run for 3 minutes. Then you'll increase the speed slightly. Uh, every time you increase the speed, a new lactate sample is drawn. So this is what we go back and talked about the blood lactate test. Uh, some people do it for 3 minutes. Some people do it for 4. I actually like the longer ones. I like to do it for 5 minutes. I think there's more time in that zone. And as well as when you prick and everything, you can rest. And I like the full rest. And the reason I like the full rest, not only in training, but in the testing, is because in the testing, it's because we also do it in the training. But I like the full rest because, like we talked about, if you do a float rest, say you go for a jog in between. I got a lot of questions about this actually, is hey, why aren't we float resting? Why are we full resting? Well, the reason is if you jog in between, your recycling system of that pyruvate that we talked about into lactate and everything is still going on. So you're recycling the lactate in your blood. So you would actually lower the lactate level in your blood between the tests if you continue to jog. Your lactate level would go down. If you full stop, that recycling method shuts down. All right, you don't need it anymore. You're not needing to convert to ATP because you're full stop. You full stop, it stays elevated a little bit. So you're back into the zone almost right away when you get back onto the run, right? So that's why we do full stop rest and not float rest.
Yeah. So you're pretty much saying that more lactate could potentially be produced when you're full resting rather than float resting.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily produced, but staying in your blood.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
Right.
okay, so let's say you're running on a treadmill, you start at low intensity, and yeah, we already went over this. So the blood concentration every time you prick your thing, and it's measured for the intensity points. When you conduct a lactate test from a low level intensity, lactate will remain relatively low next to baseline, um, when similar to at rest or even lower than the resting value, right? Because
Yeah.
that's why I just said like if you're continuing to move but you're recycling the lactate, it goes lower than even a resting value. Full rest will actually keep it up above because you're not recycling it anymore, right? So that's why,
Right.
like, actually, when you're done, it's very good to get a cool down because it'll flush out your system. You can get back to baseline almost immediately when you're done.
Yeah,
Uh,
gotcha. Okay.
one thing I didn't mention on this because I couldn't show it on the chart is I also, when I do a lactate test, I like to have an anaerobic maximum test done. And JK, you know about these, they're miserable, right? So the anaerobic maximum test, if anybody wants to know, we do it separate from our lactate test, usually about 3 or 4 hours different, just so you're on a level playing field. It is a full out 110% effort, either 400, 500, or 600-meter run, whichever one will put you in the 60 to 90-second finishing time. And you, as soon as you are done, you measure your lactate, and then every like 2 to 3 minutes afterwards, you measure your lactate. And usually about 9 to 12 minutes after you've finished, you'll get your highest lactate reading. And it's just what is your body capable? What is your blood level capable of holding? How much lactate is it capable of holding in your blood system?
So that's the purpose of that one. It's actually to understand how much lactate
Can you
can
hold?
your individual body produce.
Yep. And it's like a 1 rep max in lifting, basically.
Yeah,
Basically.
okay.
And
Interesting.
if anybody wants to know, mine is much higher than JK's.
Yeah, well, I was about to say that's what I was thinking because of well, power output, like your ability to perform power
Yeah.
more than me, or is that right? Or
Yeah, well, it's my my measured maximum anaerobic test, my maximum lactate test. I've gotten up to 21 before, 21 millimoles per liter. That means my body is flooded. If I tried to move, I wouldn't be able to. I've just been able to put myself in
wow.
that state. And I think last time you did it, you were like 14, maybe 15.
Yeah, I think 13 or 14,
But
yeah.
but you're able to hold a higher pace on your lactate threshold run, so your body clears it more efficiently. My body just will let
Right.
me spike it, right? No regulator.
Spikes it. Right, right.
Um,
Yeah, okay.
so we'll get into more of this, but I know you don't have a lot of time left, so I want to make sure we get to some of the training and testing, and training and racing philosophies and how you use it. Um,
Yep.
so Yeah, the point of aerobic and anaerobic threshold, the point when the contribution from your anaerobic energy system becomes larger. So basically the aerobic threshold test, right? That's the point where all of a sudden your anaerobic system has to contribute more. So that's the first step up. And then when you get to your anaerobic threshold, on the other hand, it indicates a point of exercise in which the lactate dissipation and the clearance can no longer match the rate of accumulation. That means that you're accumulating lactate at the exact same rate that you're dissipating it and clearing it, right? Now, if you start accumulating it more than you can clear and dissipate, you're going to tip over. And
Yeah,
that's that
eventually.
second point. That's that second inflection.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's where we talked about the exponential increase. Um, the it's generally a reasonable approximation of what intensity you could hold in a race for an hour, right? So that's why we say, hey, what's your 1 hour pace? What do you think you'd hold for an hour? It's
For an
termed as
hour,
your
yeah.
functional threshold. There's quite a big individual variance if you can actually hold it for an hour or not. But just for example, JK, we tested this on you. We have your LT2 and your LT1, and you went and ran a half marathon. You ran a half marathon at exactly your LT2 pace, and that was in
Yep.
75 minutes. So you held it for longer than 1 hour.
Yep.
And over the summer, I did something very similar. I ran a half marathon, and the first hour, I went 9.1 miles, and
Yep.
the exact rate, I actually think I went 9.15 miles, and the exact uh, speed I'm running my thresholds at is 9.1.
Yep.
So it's right on. You can get really accurate with this. Um, all right. So, and the RER test that we talked about, the respiratory exchange ratio, the anaerobic threshold is the point where CO2 produced exceeds the oxygen that you took in.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to get to key takeaways of that. Aerobic threshold is the point where your anaerobic energy system starts to contribute more to your total energy production. Aerobic energy production is still the most dominant, right? Anaerobic threshold is the point at which your lactate clearance can no longer keep up with accumulation. Both aerobic and anaerobic energy systems do work at this point and beyond this point, but all additional energy production beyond this point is anaerobic in nature. Um,
Yep.
functional threshold power, FTP. So if you've ever heard of like bike races and stuff, they talk about what's their FTP, how do you do FTP?
FTP
This is
test, yeah.
also this is also something you can do on the rower or the ski erg if you don't want to measure blood lactate. You can try to figure out your FTP. Um, it's not an easy test and it's going to really suck, but basically what you do is you can measure your anaerobic threshold. You do a 20-minute all-out test. So 20 minutes all out on the rower, 20 minutes all out on the skier, 20 minutes all out on the bike, whichever one it is. 95% of that intensity that you're able to hold, so your average intensity is a approximation of your anaerobic threshold. And I
Yeah,
always
cool.
go a little bit lower than that. So you might even go 90, 92.5% instead of 95.
Right. Yep.
All right. So how do these affect training and racing? Okay. So this is the big question. Training around the aerobic threshold is meant to improve your capacity to produce a steady output over a long duration of time. Long duration being like not 3 hours almost. There is something, it's the intensity you'd use in a marathon. If you're a
Yeah.
well-trained athlete, and this is very important, we're going to get into what well-trained versus novice and beginners and differences and what you should do if this is your early on approach to this, okay? Well-trained athlete, you might even be able to hold your aerobic threshold for Ironmans or ultras, or just below the aerobic threshold for that, right? It's very important threshold in any long distance races, um, and as a rule of thumb for most age groupers. This is important too for if you're an aging athlete, pay attention to your aerobic threshold.
Mm.
And high rocks and other hybrid fitness races, you don't want to go above your aerobic threshold because it'll quickly start to up your glycogen stores that could be better utilized in the station work. So if you're an age grouper or racing an age group or you're getting up there, you want to stay more towards your aerobic threshold than your anaerobic threshold so you can use those glycogen stores in the strength-based stations.
That's really important, right? Yeah, really important.
Uh,
Um,
don't want to be using up too much of those glycogen stores in your running because it'll be detrimental to anything strength based. Now, strength
gotcha.
based stations, I mean both the sleds, farmer carry, lunges, and wall ball.
Yeah,
Notice that like I didn't say burpees, rower, ski erg.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Remember, when you create ATP aerobically, you get 32 ATP per glucose molecule. But if you start to use up those anaerobic energy production, you only get two. Since your glycogen stores, which are turned to glucose, are limited, you might become glycogen depleted if you get too much of your energy from the anaerobic energy system. If you stay around the aerobic threshold, you also use a maximum amount of fat as fuel. Remember, we talked about the fat max, right? So, something that stops you and spares you from using your glycogen stores. So, my general rule of thumb here is if your high rocks time is over 80 minutes or you're an older athlete, what you want to do is maximize your speed and power output at your aerobic threshold. So if you are someone who would finish the high rocks in over 80 minutes or an older age group athlete, you want to maximize your speed and power at your aerobic threshold, and that's your LT1. Okay.
So is that give or take 80 minutes, Anthony, or is it 80 minutes? If you're at
I
80,
mean, I would say even age group people that might be, if you're not like a real world podium threat in the age group, you might want to stay a lot more towards your aerobic threshold level because you'll be able to output more. And
yeah.
you can slowly creep that up. And that's what we'll get into as well, is the gap between your LT1 and LT2 here is also a contributor. And you want to make sure you monitor that because you can raise it and lower it, right? Uh, so you can do it in two ways. How do you affect training and stuff? You can push your aerobic threshold with high volume of work at or slightly below your aerobic threshold. So if you want to raise up your aerobic threshold, you can push your aerobic threshold up. right? And this is what we were just talking about. If my LT2 is here and my LT1 is here, how can I get them closer? Well, I can push it up by working slightly at or below my aerobic threshold, and more time accumulated there might not raise my LT2, but it'll raise my LT1 to get close to it. All right.
And
I find
what's
that,
examples of
what's that?
what's examples of that? What's
So
examples of doing that?
So that would be like our threshold workouts that we do,
Yep.
either on the road or on the rower or on the skier. And that would
Yep.
be, say, 6 by 5 minutes with 1 minute rest,
Yep.
right at or below your LT2, LT1. Sorry.
Gotcha.
I find this to be safer and more sustainable method. Uh, and that's what I use in the hybrid engine programming. Assuming you do similar threshold workouts. Um, and you could also use tempo workouts, which we'll get into in a bit as well. Option number two is you can try to drag your LT1 up further to the right on the curve, which means increasing your pace by elevating your VO2 max as high as possible, hoping that the points below your VO2 max will just fall in line where they're supposed to. If I raise my ceiling, these other things will just fall in line. They won't stay where they're at. It might work, uh, but usually only for a limited amount of time. So if you're doing all VO2 max work, it's only a limited, it's like 8 to 12 weeks, maybe, more like six to
Right.
eight weeks. And then you'll plateau. VO2 max is also limited genetically. So you might be at or close to your limit and you might not have any more room to grow. And then you can't get those other ones to fall in line at the percentages they're supposed to of your VO2 max. So that's why I like the push method rather than the pull or drag method. A larger amount of training volume at or slightly below the aerobic threshold is the best long-term approach. There's no substitute for years and years of consistent training when it comes to developing your aerobic threshold. It's just something you have to be consistent with and put the time in, right? Lots and lots of consistent time in there. In terms of racing, well-trained athletes, the aerobic threshold is a decent estimate for your race pace if you finish a hybrid race in over 80 minutes. And like we just talked about, maybe even down to 70. Novice athletes should make sure to have a margin of error to make sure they stay well below that if you want to have a
Yeah.
consistent, steady pace. All right. I know you got to get going here, so I got two more slides. You tell me we got time for them. Um,
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
all right.
Another 5 minutes.
All right. Racing and training. Now we're going to talk about the anaerobic threshold for racing and training aspects. It's important for well-trained and younger athletes that will finish under 80 minutes and more likely around that 60-minute mark. So well-trained and even younger athletes who can hold more glycogen, right? This is important. I would say this as the elite level athletes and the podium level age group athletes will race at or close to, sometimes even slightly above their anaerobic threshold, right? JK, you are actually racing slightly above your anaerobic threshold because you're finishing under an hour. It's not much,
Yeah.
but with your in and out of the stations
Right.
as well, you are slightly above your anaerobic threshold. You want to maximize the speed or power at this threshold rather than at your aerobic threshold. So I made sure to add this specifically for you because you asked me last week or this week, why are we training at my LT2 instead of my LT1? And so this,
Yeah.
make sure there
Max
was an answer.
maximize their speed or power at the threshold at this threshold rather than the aerobic. But that is only to do with being well trained. Is that's right?
Yes.
Like
Yep. You're a well-trained elite athlete looking for that hour, sub 1 hour time domain. So we're trying to maximize your speed and power. And so we want your most time at or below, right below this threshold line. Uh,
yeah.
Knowing your anaerobic threshold is very useful in training and racing as it sets up an upper cap to the intensity level at which you can accumulate a significant amount of work. This is vital. And I think I get into this in a little bit, but we do so much other stuff besides running, besides machine work. We do strength, we do other movements, we do foundational movements, you do core work, you do skill stuff. Like there's so much other stuff that if you were going high intensity VO2 max workouts and stuff, you would be depleted and not be able to finish the other things you need to be able to do.
I think, mate, that like Anthony, I think that's a huge point, right? Because impact and doing those like all out efforts can critically negatively impact everything else that you're
Yes.
doing or
Yeah.
trying to do.
Yes. And so we need that impact load. That's where our zone two comes in. We do that stuff. We do a lot of other things, but in terms of intensity, we don't want to be spiking ourselves and finishing on the ground and not be able to finish. Like I did a threshold workout yesterday, finished it with 105 wall balls and was able to do my cool down and then still go on and do my core work, go on and do my lifts because I didn't completely exhaust myself in this. And if you're doing high volume, which kind of you need to be able to do, you need to be able to do what, like we talked about several episodes ago, minimum of effective dose, but you need to be able to do minimum effective dose in so many different modalities, so many different things that it becomes high
Yeah.
volume. It's
And then week in,
minimum
week
of
out,
everything.
right?
Yeah. Week in and week
Week
out.
in,
So,
week out, do that. Yeah.
and you need to be able to train yourself over and over and over again at those intensities. Uh,
Yeah.
Knowing, yeah, that's what we talked about. So if you go beyond the anaerobic threshold, you'll not be able to accumulate a lot of work at high intensity. You won't be able to you won't be able to do as much volume as we do if you keep going over your anaerobic threshold. It's
Yeah.
extremely important for hybrid fitness because there's so many different other modalities to work on besides running or machines.
Mm.
Uh, In training, what you want to do is maximize work accumulation around the physiological intensity zone that you want to develop. If you can accumulate a lot of work at a specific intensity, it has great effects on the training adaptations that you get. Okay. Does
Mm.
that make sense? You have any questions now? Did I answer your question from last week too?
Yeah, you did. Well, you did when I messaged you as well, but you definitely did there as well. Yeah,
Awesome.
definitely.
Cool. And then um, just continued on. This is the last slide. Rather than staying slightly above the anaerobic threshold and making it through maybe 3 reps of your threshold interval workout, if you stay right below it and do 5 reps, you've done really well and you've got some really good training adaptations through that and you're able to get the more volume in, right?
Yeah.
Um, Doing work around the anaerobic threshold, either continuously, which would be like your tempo work, or intervals, making sure that you maximize your work accumulation seems to work for developing the threshold the best, right? And pushing it through the cycles we've done. That's why like we'll test your lactate again coming up. You'll see it should have increased again and we'll be able to push
Yeah.
it up. But all the work we do is to get it for the next test, right? We don't test every single day so that you're working exactly in that zone. We get a pace to test and then we do a whole cycle, we do a whole training block, and then we test again and say, oh, look, that training block was effective because it moved your graph up and to the right or just to the right, you know? Uh,
Yep.
it can be done through variable intervals or tempo runs. I prefer, like I said earlier, intervals with the full stop rest, not float rest. Um, the reason why anaerobic threshold is also important for all athletes is that when your aerobic threshold converges towards your anaerobic threshold, the only way to improve further is to raise your anaerobic threshold. So you'll have room to raise your aerobic threshold again. Right?
Right.
So it's super
Yeah.
important. We go back to the age group or the older athletes or beginner athletes, novices. You can raise your aerobic threshold, which you should be doing, but at a certain point, you have to raise your anaerobic threshold to have any more room to raise your aerobic threshold.
To raise. Yeah, gotcha.
Uh, you can work your aerobic threshold, or sorry, your anaerobic threshold in different modalities. So, JK, when I tack on 100 wall balls at the end of a threshold workout, or I tack on 4 minutes of burpees for you, um,
Yeah.
I'm trying, and I tell you to work at the same pace you were just working at. We are working your anaerobic threshold in a different modality. So you're
Correct. Yeah.
getting the same engine gaining benefits, but they are in a different movement pattern.
Yeah.
You don't need to perform all your threshold work in running. We have 9 movements, at least 9 movements in high rocks, and there's more if you do DecaFit and other things. And there's so many foundational movements that we have: kettlebell deadlifts, sandbag cleans, dumbbell snatches. There's so many other things too, and foundational movements that you can use to support those 9 functional movements You need to make sure you do the work in those foundation, the priority movements at the anaerobic threshold intensity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh,
So,
Anthony, like I'll be completely honest, and for the listeners to wrap it up, you guys have just got a really comprehensive, um, thorough podcast on Threshold, and mate, I'll thank you for doing that because the more and more I work with you, I'm the first to want to say this. The more and more I am learning as well, and it's so powerful. I always say, and I think I did say this to you last week, Anthony. If I'm not helping my athletes to understand why we are doing this, why we are doing that, there is no point in the training in my eyes. So
yeah,
this type of stuff is so important to understand because if you don't understand it, why are you doing it? Um, you need to understand. And every time I ask you, Anthony, a question of like, why are we doing this? It's just as simple as me wanting to understand to make sure that I know the purpose of the work. But thank you for that. I learned a lot, and I'm assuming the listeners have learned a lot as well.
yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm glad we were able to do that. I actually enjoy, like I said, researching, and maybe I'll come to more of these podcasts. I like it when we create a topic and I can make a PowerPoint and we can have like an educational hour, because it really
Definitely,
helps me too to be able to communicate this information because I feel like it helps me understand it even more.
definitely,
Um,
mate. Definitely.
so I just
Thank
wanted
you,
to,
Anthony. And
I think JK, you got to head out soon and I'll wrap up with some reviews and stuff. But do you have anything else you want to say?
no, just thank you. We'll see you next week, and thank you for the listeners. If you want to shout out or message us on Instagram, jk.jameskelly on Instagram. But thank you once again, Anthony. We will talk soon.
Thanks, JK. And then, guys, I just wanted to read to you. We got some great reviews, and so I wanted to read a couple of them coming over from YouTube. Phil Astiles enjoyed this. Thank you. And at I think it's Tristan, but it's try 5 at T4N. 4 to 5 pints usually works well for post-race recovery wind down. So thank you guys. We appreciate the interaction. If you guys have a minute and you'd like to give us a review or a rating, we'd really appreciate it. It helps us reach more people and gets us out in front of people so that we can help everybody we would like to. If you'd like to find me, I'm at the Hybrid Engine or at a Wild Parasini on Instagram. You can also find the Hybrid Coaching Podcast on YouTube. And soon, one day, we will have an Instagram for it where we can share this. All right, guys. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you for listening to the Hybrid Coaching Podcast. If you have any questions you'd like your hosts to answer, or if you'd like to reach out and ask us any questions or inquire about training, please reach out to James Kelly on Instagram at jk.jameskelly. That's jk.jameskelly on Instagram. Or you can find him, Georgie Vesley and James Kelly, on YouTube. You can also find me, Anthony Parasini, at The Hybrid Engine on Instagram or The Hybrid Engine on YouTube. Thank you again for listening and have a great day.